Well, in the Chad Daybell case, the prosecution rested its case. And then there was a bombshell dropped by the judge. Learn about the murder weapon used in the case and much more on this episode of Charlie Crimebuster. Yep, it's what some people are calling, well, they're calling it the fastest minutes in podcasting.
The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the individuals interviewed and participating in this show and do not represent those of Charlie Crimebuster nor Peacemaker Network. All individuals described or mentioned in the podcast should be considered innocent until found guilty in a court of law. This podcast contains subject matter such as violence and graphic descriptions which may not be suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised.
Well, hello and welcome to this episode of Charlie Crimebuster. Sure glad to have you a part of the Charlie Crime train today. Hey, by the way, if you are listening to us for the first time, we always urge you to reach out with a shout out. Whether you're a seasoned listener or a first-time listener, we welcome you to reach out with a shout-out. You can make suggestions about future podcasts. You can ask questions about this podcast. Hey, you can even lodge an objection. That's right, you can disagree. It's a safe spot. Reach out to me, charliecrimebuster at gmail.com. That's charliecrimebuster@gmail.com. Hey, if you'd like to support the program, go on over there to peacemakernetwork.com, peacemakernetwork.com. There you can become a badge, BADGE supporter. For as little as $3 a month, you can not only help the podcast, but hey, you can also help those brave men and women who run toward danger instead of away from danger. Of course, every week we tell you about our law enforcement, first responders, and military, and how we support these brave men and women who protect us. Go to peacemakernetwork.com, find out all about that there. And if you'd like to get caught up on other episodes, well, let me invite you to go on over to charliecrimebuster.com. We have a website. Yep, website right there. You can find a lot of episodes there for your listener enjoyment. Hey, want to also tell you, we have just launched our YouTube channel, and boy, are we excited. You talk about a tremendous response. It's blowing up, and we appreciate that. If you'd like to be a part of the YouTube channel, just go to YouTube and hashtag Charlie Crimebuster. You'll find us right there. All right, that's our housekeeping. We got it out of the way. Let's get right in today's episode. Talk about it. As I told you in the opening, we're going to talk about a bombshell, and boy, it was a bombshell. You see, less than an hour after the state prosecutors rested their case in Daybell's triple murder charge, well, Judge Stephen Boyce, he dropped a real bombshell. You see, he had identified an error in the murder indictment. That's right, an error in the murder indictment. You see, after the state concluded their arguments and jurors were dismissed for the day, well, Judge Boyce, he heard arguments from the defense in what is kind of typically pretty standard motion. They make a motion where they say one last plea requesting acquittal for the defendant. But however, what was not a pretty standard was in an unrelated, unforeseen twist of events. You see, the judge, he found there was a significant error in the Daybell's indictment. You see, court documents had reflected an incorrect date on count four of the indictment. That was the first-degree murder charge for J.J. Vallow, the little boy. Well, of course, defense attorney John Pryor, first of all, he wanted a directed verdict, which is a ruling from the judge rather than the jury if the judge determines there's no legally sufficient basis for a reasonable jury to reach a conclusion. You see, he argued, Pryor said, that the state provided evidence that was insufficient. He said there was no indication that Daybell was present for the murders of J.J. and Tylee. Well, Boyce said he was prepared to make a ruling on that, but he was also concerned about this clerical mistake. The judge, you see, he wanted a little time to kind of sort it all out. So he comes back after recess, and he ultimately denies all the requests and challenges from Mr. Pryor. And he justified that because he said there was valid witness testimonies and there was sufficient evidence provided by the state. And then he also denied the challenge to that count 4, saying that the court, now get this, the court did not authorize the February amendment in which that typo mistake was made. So there you have it. A gotcha, moment in court. Yep, they had made a mistake on one of the dates. It was a typo. But there are certain things in justice where they look over those typos and it doesn't really impact the real evidence of the case. So now, everybody had a sigh of relief when they found out that typo wasn't going to stop the trial and wasn't going to stop that last murder indictment. So now here we have the defense is rested. Now keep in mind, there's been like 67 witnesses. And they were all brought out in the case in chief for the prosecution. But this week, in the trial, there are 3 things that stood out to me that I want to share with you. And they are biggies. They are all biggies. There was a phone call. There is a phone GPS settings. And there were phone texts. You know, I was almost thinking about calling this episode The Murder Weapon. And saying that the murder weapon, there's not been an identifiable murder weapon brought to the jury. Well, I believe in a way there has. I believe the murder weapon really was the phone. Because we can see how a vital role that the phone of the defendants played in this case. You see, it was through this means of communication, the phone, that you can find the MO of the defendants. It's through this means of communication, the phone, you can see the motive of the defendant. And it's through this means of communication that I'm going to share with you today that will even reveal the means of the death of the victims. And we're going to see it all. We're going to see it all through that little device that most of us do not leave home without. That device that's with you right now, within your arm's reach more than likely, it's called the cell phone. But first of all, let's talk about the phone call. You see, there was an actual phone call played to the jury this past week. It was a call between Chad and Lori, and it was recorded from jail to Chad's cell phone. I should say Sad Chad's cell phone, shouldn't I? Now, most all jail calls between family and friends are recorded. Most people know that. Of course, there is the exception with calls with an attorney, and those calls, of course, are privilege. Now, most people know, and no doubt, Chad and Lori knew that as well, that those calls are recorded. But you see, they thought that they were smart enough to use code in their conversations so they could talk about things without law enforcement catching on. But my friend, just like our country, the Nazis, we broke their code. The Japanese, we broke their code during World War II. So did law enforcement break their code? And I got to tell you, it wasn't very difficult. And I'm going to show you how it wasn't so difficult as we get through these things. So in their phone calls, we learned some amazing and incriminating things. And I'm going to share those things with you. But right now, we want to take a moment to kind of lighten the load of what we share and share with you what we call our Crazy Crook story. You see, every week we try to share a Crazy Crook story so that we can take away from some of the darkness that we cover in these types of crimes that we report on. So, my friend, it's now time for Charlie Crimebuster's Crazy Crook of the Week. Now, we've all heard the phrase, kids say the darndest things. There's even been TV productions that has entertained us with what kids say, and boy, are they funny. But did you know that sometimes kids not only say the darndest things, but they do the darndest things? Well, of course you do, because you see lots of those on your social media platform as they share the cute things that kids say and do. But here, my friend, is a kid that did the darndest thing, and it ended up in a Crazy Crook story. And to set up the story, well, it all happened on Father's Day. You see, on Father's Day, and that's coming up, by the way, but a Father's Day in the past, there was a 10-year-old boy who was playing with his father's old handcuffs on Father's Day. Now, you can imagine that, can't you? I believe kids today still play cops and robbers, right? But you see, this kid Well, he caught a real robber. You see, he had cuffed himself to his daddy. His daddy's name was William Klein, Jr., and they were having lots and lots of fun until they realized, they lost the key to the handcuffs. So Mr. Klein thought he would be smart and teach his kid what to do when in trouble. So William, he called the police there in Des Moines, Iowa. He got the police there to help him get the cuffs off. However, as it is routine, when police respond to various things and talk to various people, they ran Klein through their database, and you guessed it, they found 2 arrest warrants. Yep, 2 arrest warrants outstanding. And so shortly thereof, after they took the cuffs off of William, well, they ended up putting the cuffs on again. But this time, it was the real thing. So this guy, who calls the cops to get him out of the cuffs, with not 1, but 2 outstanding warrants. This guy that was so crazy that even though he had 2 outstanding warrants on him, he called the po-po on himself. Well, this guy indeed becomes Charlie Crimebuster's Crazy Crook of the Week. Now back to that jailhouse phone call. Here are the things that we learn in this phone call. First, bet you did not know, I bet you didn't know this, apparently now you can actually text the dead. Well, at least if you're Chad Daybell, you can. You see, he immediately mentions to Lori on this phone call that he had texted Ray. Now, Ray was the code name for Alex Cox, Lori's brother. He's the guy that I've always termed the spiritual hitman for Chad and Lori. But the unusual thing, well, is that when he's speaking to Lori about texting Alex, well, Alex Cox, he's already dead. You see, this answers a question that myself and many of you probably have had all along. After she was arrested, after Lori Vallow was arrested, did she still believe in this alternate reality that the prosecution talked about that Lori and Chad had lived in? Well, you bet they did, because this alternate reality, it became the way that they were both set to get for themselves sex, power, and money for their relationship. And it was in full force on this recorded phone call and in many other phone calls. So the first thing we learned, that they are still living, even though she's in jail, in this alternate universe. And we also learned that this alternate universe on this phone call, we learned about a blueprint. Yep, a plan. A plan that included the murder of 4 innocent people and the attempted murder of another. Incidentally, 2 of those victims were children. You see, they began to discuss this blueprint for murder all in code. When Lori inquired of Chad, he said that Alex was still optimistic that their plan would be carried out. Now, keep in mind, Chad's telling Lori he's talking to Chad, communicating with Chad, texting Chad, even though Chad is dead. We know now that plan included getting rid of anything or anybody that was keeping Chad and Lori from being together and unencumbered, as they were supposed to lead the 144,000 at the second coming of Christ. But there was a problem, though, and we see firsthand how Chad navigated this problem. They did not plan for the fact that Lori would be arrested for not presenting her children to authorities. And Alex, under the direction of Chad, well, he would take care of the wet work. He'd go out and attempt to kill people and killed people. Wet work in the criminal world is a code for murder. And here is Chad and Lori talking about the so-called contractor. Yep, that contractor was the spiritual hitman, Alex. She mentions that Alex said there was only a 3% chance of trouble in their plan. You see, their plan was to get rid of the zombies so they could go on with their work. But the contractor, Alex, he assured them this could be done. He would shoot Charles and claim self-defense, which he did. He would then, when the time was right, and the zombies appeared to take over the children, he'd get rid of the zombies by taking the bodies so that these souls would be free. And he would dispose of the bodies so no bodies would be found. They could simply say that JJ was with someone else, which they did, and that they could say that Tylee was off to school, which they did. That was the plan. But as Lori said in this phone call, she said, we were told that there was only a 3% chance of trouble. But that 3% turned into 100% of trouble. They somewhat laughed and joked about it, but then they got serious. As Chad said, I just want to go find him and take him by the throat and ask him what happened. You see, they did not plan in their blueprint for the police to issue a show cause order to produce the children. And they could not produce the children because the children, they were already dead and buried in Chad's backyard. Now, before we leave this phone call, it's important to realize something else. This plan was seen and revealed by Chad. That's right, Chad. She asked Chad for assurance that the plan was still on target in spite of the setbacks. This wasn't Chad coming to Lori as she the planner. This was her coming to Chad that Chad was the planner. You see, he had said that he had asked Alex, and Alex said everything was fine, optimistic, everything's going to turn out all right. But Lori, she was insistent. She said, I'm not talking about him. I want to know from you. Give me assurance that everything's okay. You see, this is important because I know there's still some of you folks out there. You still think that poor little old Chad is sweet and innocent. He was just manipulated by this former beauty queen. But my friend, it is he, Chad, who assures her that all will be well. But how do you know? And he says back to her, he said, I've seen it for myself. It's been revealed to me with my powers of talking to the dead and seeing into the future. This is not going to be solo. You and I both are going to be together again. We're going to reign, and we're going to experience love and majesty and glory. Did you pick up on that? Chad is the one who can speak to the dead. Chad is the one who sees visions of the future. Chad is the one who even predicted when people go dark and become zombies. Well, we're going to tell you more about that in a moment. But next, let's talk quickly about the GPS. It was tracking Alexis Cox's cell phone, the GPS, right after the kids that were gone missing that actually led authorities back to the Daybell property to find the graves of the children. And it was, listen to this, the GPS of Alex that tracked him right into the area of Chad's house the night that Tammy, Chad's wife, died. She was healthy, getting ready to run a marathon. Died in her sleep, so Chad said. And they really thought that they were going to get away with it because there were two inexperienced coroners who took Chad's word that Tammy had been sick and died naturally. But later, when they exhumed her body, it was proven, and I believe they proved it in court, that Tammy was smothered to death. It's even possible that someone held her down while the other one smothered her. You see, that very night, Alex parked at a church parking lot, very close to Chad's house, 2 miles. But he didn't know anybody in the area. There was no other reason for him to be there. And there was an entire hour that was unaccounted for that they could not find where his GPS was. Just enough time for him to turn off the phone, long enough to go in and help Chad murder his wife and then leave. Just enough time for Chad to pick him up, bring him to the house, assist in the killing of his wife. You see, my friend, Chad and Alex were much closer than you think. You see, Alex was supposed to be on a trip to visit Lori, who was already in Hawaii. He was planned to go on a trip with other people to visit Lori. But according to Lori, get this, he had to stay back and help Chad with something. And this was just days before he had attempted to shoot Tammy, but his weapon misfired. Just days later, she dies in her bed. Reported by a medical examiner who did a later autopsy that she died by smothering, and there were even bruises on her arm. So again, my friend, the cell phone. The cell phone is the weapon that's in their hands, and it was the cell phone that allowed authorities to track both of them to be to the place where Tammy died. I love the line of questioning. She asked the guy who was on the stand talking about this phone call, where was Tammy's body found? In Chad's bed. Where were the children's bodies found? in Chad's backyard. You see, perhaps the most crucial evidence of the entire trial, though, is what's coming up next. And that was the texts, T-E-X-T-S, the texts that were shared between Chad and Lori. And I want to tell you about that. And you hang on to your hat, my friend. You're going to see where all this comes together for the prosecution. They almost just wrapped it up in a bow when they went through these texts. We're going to tell you all about that in just a moment. But each week we try to give you some news you can use, some things that can help you. And right now, it is time for James Buckland, our producer, to share with you news you can use.
Military personnel are more likely to make a suicide attempt or die by suicide if they are experiencing intense emotional pain. This could include depression and trauma, such as post-traumatic stress. Risk for suicide increases when military personnel experience both depression and post-traumatic stress together. They experience things like hopelessness or perceived burdensomeness, self-hatred, unbearability, guilt, and even some disconnectedness. They'll say things like this: things will never going to change. It's always going to be the same. Or, you all would be better off without me. Or comments like this: I'm worthless and there's nothing good about me. Or even, this is terrible, I just can't take it anymore. Or, it's all my fault. And then this one: no one values me or cares about me. You see that last one? No one values me or cares about me. This is what Peacemaker Network is all about. We do care. We do value our first responders, law enforcement personnel, and military, and this is why we shine our light on PTSD and suicide awareness. We need our heroes healthy, physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. Join the Peacemaker Network today. PeacemakerNetwork.com.
Thank you, James, as usual, right on target. Now, my title for this podcast is Until Texts Do Us Part, and I do believe that these texts will keep Chad and Lori apart for the rest of their lives. You see, less than 24 hours after the aforementioned phone call that we talked about, well, in 24 hours, Chad is in cuffs and arrested and is facing the death penalty for the death of little JJ and Tylee and the death of his wife, Tammy. Now, the text messages shared revealed something that was called Chad Daybell's death percentage message. Daybell's death percentage message. He would actually predict when it was time for people to die, literally. You see, it was the FBI agent Doug Hart. He testified that 7 days after Lori Vallow's previous husband, Charles Vallow, was shot and killed, well, Chad and Lori began texting each other about, quote, unquote, the death percentages of 3 people. Those 3 people are the people that Chad Daybell is now on trial for killing: JJ, Tylee, and Tammy. You see, Hart, he was tasked with looking into the couple's texts. And he was the final witness, by the way, that was called by the prosecution in the trial. He told jurors that there was a death percentage. It would refer to how close the couple believed that a person was to death. The conversation about death percentages, well, it was a whole bunch of texts, all kinds of detail, over 3 weeks in July and August of 2019. Now, Hart said that his investigation found that Chad and Daybell in these text conversations, well, let me give you an example. At one point, Daybell, he texts Chad, Lori texts Tad, after speaking about her niece's children. And she said, quote, listen to this, that she and her niece was both so tired taking care of demons. We are weary. Please ask the Lord to take them. Did you hear that? Called them demons, said, please ask the Lord to take them. Now later, Chad, well, he comes back and says JJ's percentage was at 0. And Lori responded she sensed JJ was barely attached to his body. Now Hart also spoke about texts in which Chad Daybell made reference to Charles Vallow's death percentage. And, get this now, hold on to it, he compared it to Tammy Daybell's percentage. Hart said, quote, Charles Vallow didn't have a heart attack or die in his sleep. No, it wasn't a natural death that they're talking about with these percentages. You see, Charles Vallow, my friend, was shot and killed. So, my friend, these death percentages by Chad Daybell? No, it's not simply a reference to natural death. It's much more than a natural death. You see, Hart also talked about a specific set of texts on August the 10th, 2019. It was about a month before Tylee's death. He said that it showed the clearest and most specific reference to a plan regarding Tylee and JJ. He went on to say that Lori asked Chad if there was a perfectly orchestrated plan to take the children. Did you hear that? Is there a perfectly orchestrated plan to take the children? Chad Daybell's response, quote, "There is a plan being orchestrated for the children. I was shown last night how it fit together. But it was taken from my mind, of course." And Hart said that the couple frequently referred to a big plan and a finish line. And of course, that finish line was for Chad and Lori Daybell to live out this fantasy life that they have together. Now, after Lori Daybell, she mentioned a text that Chad Daybell would have to go to his home after visiting her. And he comes back and says, get this, listen to this, quote, unquote, that extreme changes were coming, and he welcomed the change. You hear that? Extreme changes coming? Well, literally 3 months from that date, Tylee, JJ, Tammy, all dead. And on October the 5th, 2019, in another text, Chad Daybell, he talked to Lori, and he said that Tammy, his wife, was in limbo, and there was a demonic person named Viola in her body. Now, here's what the text said, quote, "I have connected with Tammy in limbo. She is very frustrated, upset. She wants Viola to be removed as soon as possible. Not fully sure of the timing for the removal, but once her actions verify the differences, I don't want to wait." Did you hear that? That was from Chad Daybell to Lori. Now, Agent Hart said that removal would indicate a physical death. That was based on the review of other messages. And he said a few days later after that one where he said that he wants Viola to be removed as soon as possible, he said, "I don't want to wait." Just a few days later was the very first attempt on Tammy's life, October the 9th. And then she died a few weeks later on October 19th, 2019. And in the messages sent on the morning of October the 20th. Now, this is just after she died, the day after she died. Lori and Chad, they texted about spending the night together and finding a condo in Hawaii to live in the start of the next month. And here's what Chad Daybell says, quote, "I'm feeling sad, but it isn't for the reason everyone thinks." He was sad that he couldn't be with Lori. Hart said neither Chad nor Lori ever expressed grief about the loss of their spouses. And remember, he married just a couple of weeks later after his wife died, November the 5th. He married 2019. So, my friend, for all of you who still think that Chad is a sweet little Chad who was manipulated by this woman, this beauty queen, then I want to ask you another question, and listen to this. What kind of sweet man would want to cause pain to children? Yep, that's what I said, cause pain to children. Because, my friend, in these texts, in addition to Chad Daybell being a source that Lori would look for death percentages, Chad would also talk about, quote, unquote, giving pain to people around Lori Daybell. One of the messages, he told Lori that Tylee's death percentages is at 0.13, JJ's at 99.99. Here's what Chad said in the text. He talked about, listen to this, turning up pain and placing a spiritual virus inside Tylee. In that same message, Chad Daybell said he had visited JJ and told JJ to follow Amy into the light, which we all know is a common reference to death. Lori's response, "Oh, that's sweet. I miss you terribly." Yeah. Now, Lori also asked about death percentages for her niece's son, 3 or 4 years of age at the time. Chad Daybell, he said the boy's desire to part said 80%, and Daybell said he used his sword to slice the child's aura. Now, listen to this. He decreased his pain tolerance to 1% and greatly increased his pain. Did you hear that? Decreased the pain tolerance of the child to 1%, greatly increased his pain. Here is this grown man talking about bringing pain to children. They were on a road trip, and Chad Daybell offered to cause pain to those 2 3s you're riding with, referring to a rate that he had previously given. Lori said, "Well, hold off until we arrive. They may be a mistake to deal with, but I'll text you if they start acting up, and quote, unquote, we can zap them." Do you hear this? Here is a man talking about people becoming zombies and the death percentage that they're ready to die. He's talking about inflicting pain in the lives of children. And he's justifying it all, saying, well, when they depart their bodies, they will be free. He is the guy that's orchestrating this whole plan with this crazy, mixed up, demonic theology that he's spewing out of his mouth about people going dark and needing to die. And they had their contractor. Remember, we talked about the contractor. That contractor with the blueprint was Alex Cox. We know that he attempted to shoot Brandon Bordeaux. We know that he was the one that attempted to shoot Tammy. He was the one that were with the kids and buried the kids. He was the one that killed the kids, in my opinion. What Chad part in that? At least it was given the order to do it, and maybe even helping him do it. We don't know. So is this man guilty? I believe he is. And I believe we're going to hear the jury agree with me that he is guilty. I know all this is alleged at this point, but once the verdict comes in and he's guilty, the next question is, will he get the death penalty? I sure hope so, and I think if you listen carefully to these texts and this phone call, you will agree that if any man deserved it, Chad Daybell does. All right, so that's it. We're wrapping up this week now. The prosecution has settled their part of the case. They put their case in chief, they call it. They put their case on to the jury. Now we're going to hear from Attorney Pryor. How will he defend Chad? What kind of defense will he really bring to the jury? Will it be enough to overturn all this enormous evidence that's been shared to this jury? Well, we're going to find out about it. We're going to report, and we're going to tell you all about it next week. By the way, if you'd like to know more about what we've been talking about, join us for our YouTube channel. We always take a day after the podcast is released to talk about the podcast, and that's on our YouTube channel. You can go to YouTube with the hashtag Charlie Crimebuster. Yes, tag Charlie Crimebuster. YouTube, tag Charlie Crimebuster, and you'll find us there. Join us on our YouTube channel as we discuss the things that we report on every week. Until this time next time, this is Charlie Crimebuster reminding you, be safe, be alert, for the life you save, it may be your very own.
You have been listening to Charlie Crimebuster. You can find additional podcasts at charliecrimebuster.com. You can also support our first responders, military, and law enforcement communities at peacemakernetwork.com, or subscribe to our YouTube channel using tag @CharlieCrimebuster. Even visit our Facebook page, facebook.com/CharlieCrimebuster. Or if you would like to make suggestions for future podcasts, please send your ideas to charliecrimebuster@gmail.com. That's charliecrimebuster@gmail.com. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope that you will join us next week for another exciting crime story with Charlie Crimebuster.